Welcome and good morning. I'm Janice Clay, Chair of the Civic Caucus, a group dedicated to nonpartisan debate and discussion of issues important to Minnesota. Today, we will continue our look back at Minneapolis Charter Reform Efforts through the years. We're deeply grateful to have Iric Nathanson, a historian, here. Paul Ostro will start us out with an introduction, and Clarence Schaubetter will take over as moderator. Thanks to all of you and to the Civic Caucus interview group.
Good morning, everyone. And yes, we are very glad to have with us this morning Iric Nathanson. Iric had a distinguished career as a public servant. Iric started his public service on the staff of former Congressman Don Fraser from 1967 to 1978. He followed that service with service for housing and urban development in Washington, D.C. And then I came to know Iric a bit as an outstanding staff member and leader of the Minneapolis Community Development Agency through a really critical time in that agency's history from 1983 to 2003. Iric has become one of the maybe the most renowned Minneapolis historian. Iric has written 7 books, among them Minneapolis in the 20th Century, and most recently a book, biography of Don Fraser that was published in 2018. And that is a book entitled Minnesota's Quiet Crusader. And part of that Quiet Crusade included efforts that Mayor Fraser himself initiated to reform the Minneapolis City Charter while Mayor Fraser was the mayor of our city in Minneapolis. But Iric was very humble when we spoke about him speaking today, and saying that he was not someone who proposed these changes, doesn't, in his view, claim to be an expert, but I beg to differ because I think he is an expert on Minneapolis history. And I think one of the things the caucus stands for is the importance of that history and learning from that history. And so that's why I think Iric has a very important story to tell. So Iric, again, thank you so much for being with us. And we normally start with 15 minutes or so. I'd love to hear about Mayor Fraser's efforts or even other efforts. In speaking with you, I know you've also researched efforts even before that one, and then we'll have a good conversation about what that history may teach us about the efforts of reform today. Good. And Clarence Schaubetter will be the one who will be moderating the discussion today.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Paul. Quite a distinguished group here. I'm very impressed. A little odd. I recognize almost all the names here, and so it's really very good to be here. Just a couple of things. I decided in my recent years that I've stopped calling myself a historian. I really say that I write about history, and what I'm particularly interested in is that sort of intersection between history and journalism, and particularly more recent history. And one of the reasons that I've gotten involved in doing this and writing about it, because I really think that the stories of our recent past, while many of us still lived through that era, need to be preserved. So I hesitate to call myself a historian because while I do footnotes, I don't obsess over them. And I really have been lucky enough to be able to sort of tell the recent stories. But I do want to just comment a little bit about the charter in 1900. Because I think that was a really interesting period, and it really points up some what I think are very interesting differences between Minneapolis and St. Paul. And I think some of you probably have been aware of that as well. In 1900, and as I told Paul, I got into charter because I had written an article. I was researching an article about life in Minneapolis in 1900. And as I was doing that research, I came across the account of the charter referendum in Minneapolis in 1900. And then I later discovered that St. Paul had its own charter referendum in 1900. And both of those referenda were significant because the cities needed to adopt a home rule charter in order to give themselves home rule. Without the citizens agreeing to a charter, the cities had to go to the legislature hat in hand every time that they wanted to make a change in the structure of their government. And I think that's exactly how we got the park board. And I think 1883 almost, I will say that my dates are getting a little vague. So in any case, 1900, Minneapolis has a charter election. St. Paul has a charter election. St. Paul approves its charter referendum. And there's a great cartoon in my book. And if I really knew about screen sharing, I would try to show it to you. There's a great cartoon in the St. Paul Pioneer Press showing a Democrat, a Republican, and an independent voter pushing the charter steamroller down the road, saying, you know, we're all in this together. And so there was real consensus in St. Paul to adopt their new charter. Minneapolis, however, it was a huge fight. And the cartoon that I have in my book shows the charter opponents, mainly city council members, throwing vegetables, rotten fruit at the new charter, because the Minneapolis charter plan in 1900 would have given Minneapolis a very strong mayor, a classic strong mayor structure. And council was very much opposed. And in Minneapolis, the charter referendum was defeated. And a historian named Mary Wingard has made an interesting observation about the difference between Minneapolis and St. Paul. And she says that in St. Paul, because it had been eclipsed by Minneapolis in 1990 census, Minneapolis finally surpasses St. Paul. St. Paul realized that they were not going to be the dominant metropolis in the upper Midwest, and they sort of banded together. Labor, management, Bishop Ireland, who was an important power, realized that he had to bring the Catholic community together. And the business owners in St. Paul realized that their employees were also their customers, because many of the major businesses in St. Paul were breweries. In Minneapolis, a very different structure, because of course our dominant industry in Minneapolis was milling, and that was a business that had an international market. And the milling titans didn't really have to worry that much about their employees. They took the typical capitalist view that period, and so we had lots of labor strife. We had political strife in Minneapolis. And so Minneapolis was a much less cohesive city than St. Paul, according to Mary Wingard. And so I think that really indicated why St. Paul was able to move ahead with and give itself home rule in 1900, while Minneapolis had to wait until 1920. And over the years, and I can't remember exactly which years, Minneapolis tried to pass a charter plan, a home rule charter, I think in 1904, 1912, I think 2 or 3 times in the first 2 decades, Minneapolis tried to pass a home rule charter. And finally in 1920, they passed the home rule charter, but only by codifying the existing sort of crazy quilt weak mayor system. And that's basically what survived until Don Fraser became mayor. Hubert Humphrey tried to get a charter plan through. Naftlin tried to get a charter plan through. None of those really succeeded. So just a little bit about, we're into Don Fraser's era. And I think many of you probably know this story. I was with Don during those days. Don, of course, loses his Senate primary against Bob Short in 1978. There's a huge outpouring of feeling for Don. Don had a very strong base of support in Minneapolis. And at the very last minute, and Lee Munich is here, Lee knows that story very well because Lee goes out to the airport and tries to persuade Don Fraser not to run for mayor. So at the very last minute, Don decides he wants to be mayor, and he swoops back into Minneapolis, gets the endorsement from the Minneapolis DFL. And I think that really sets the stage for the conflict that Don has with the city council during his 13 years as mayor. And the council members, and I know many of you were around that period, remember this, that the council leaders, Alice, Rainville, Walt Dietrich, sort of really views Don as an interloper. Why is this guy, jumping in from Washington? What does he know about city government? We've got plenty of other people who could be mayor. What is this, Washington fans think he's doing in helping his way into city government? And so there was really a lot of resentment on the council to Don coming in as mayor. But Don had a huge base of support from the DFL, and so he very easily gets the endorsement. But still, the council members are still chafing at who they see as this interloper. And I think if Al Hofstede had remained mayor, and I think some of you remember Al's era, we probably wouldn't have had the charter battles that we did, because of course Al was part of the council. And I remember this, and maybe Clarence and Paul, you can refresh my memory. There's a charter proposal to give the mayor budgeting authority, and that happens during Al's term as mayor. That sounds right?
Yep. That's right, Eric. And the other thing, there's a Municipal Finance Commission report.
Yes, that's
which was
right.
quite detailed. That kind of was one of the recommendations from that.
Yeah. So
there had been a dispute about the planning function for a few years in the late 60s, and that produced a Citizens League report that called for the merger of the office of mayor and the president of the city council, but it never went to the Charter Commission. The thought was at the time there was going to be a new president of the city council and a new mayor, and maybe we could just get the two of them together, go to the state. While you're right that we had a home rule charter, we didn't hesitate to go to the state for any changes that we thought we really wanted to make anyway. So we did. And so, but nothing came out of that, except a few years later, some pieces of it actually got adopted as part of the charter through the Charter Commission.
So anyway, so Don is now mayor, and he's having great disputes, particularly with Alice Rainville, who is a very strong figure on the council. And he finally realizes that he needs to have a truce with Alice. And so they come up with this sort of informal power sharing arrangement called the Executive Committee, where the mayor will meet with the president of the city council and I think 3 council members to sort of supposedly chart policy and view appointments. And in, again, Clarence and Paul, you can refresh my memory, 1984, the executive committee is put into the charter, but it still is sort of a consultative body. The mayor is just one of 4 members, and the theory was that this group would get together collegiately and they would sort of come to consensus on issues. Well, it doesn't really happen that way, and Don is frustrated again because he's sort of outvoted, and he realizes that the executive committee as it was structured really isn't working particularly well. So he comes up in 1988 when he is running for election. Let me see, I will have to confess, unless I have the years written right in front of me, they get a little vague. So he comes up with 2 proposals, one that it would make him the president of the city council, and the other, I think, to have a strong mayor system using the I think, strengthening the role of the executive committee. So in 1988, the Charter Commission turns it down, and it's very interesting how the Charter Commission during that period was very much in line with the council, and they were the Charter Commission was resistant to sort of a strong mayor push, certainly, and based on what I read in the Star Tribune this week, maybe that this current Charter Commission's got a different view of things. So in any case, Don does not get his proposals in 1988 through the Charter Commission, and he has to petition. And I remember standing out on the street corner with him. I'm Don Fraser at 7:30 in the morning in his ragged overcoat, you know, buttonholing people to sign a petition. And I think it was 5% of the, I don't know, one of you can maybe tell me that number, and to get a petition on the ballot. So he does petition, council doesn't like it, the Charter Commission doesn't like it, they monkey around with the wording. And in 1988, Don's proposal is defeated again, but he came fairly close. I think it's 46% of the vote. And then let's see, Dennis Schulstead has a proposal as well. Well, all right. So jumping to 1989, then, in 1989, Don is running for re-election, his last election, and he brings back the proposal. And what he does, and I should say, just as a little digression, Don is very interested in how machines work. And we always used to kid in his office that he would retire from Congress and be a telephone repairman, because he always liked to take machines apart and tinker with them. He just loved to do this. He had a workshop in the basement when he lived in Minneapolis. And he took his interest in physical machines over to the realm of government institutions. And he liked to look at how government institutions worked, and he liked to sort of take them apart and restructure them. And there was an interesting connection between his work in Washington on institutional reform and his work in Minneapolis. And when he was in Washington, he was very interested in congressional reform and restructuring the Democratic Caucus. As many of you know, he was very involved in Democratic Party reform, and was involved, particularly interested in setting up a leadership group in the Democratic National Committee. So leadership and structure was always an interest of Don's. And so he takes this interest over to city government, and he decides, okay, if we're going to have a executive committee, and that sort of has been enshrined in charter, let's really give the mayor some political heft. And so he comes up with a proposal that says that the mayor can propose appointments to city council, can propose appointments to city department heads, and the executive committee can either approve or reject those proposals, but they can't substitute a name of their own. So if they don't like the proposal that the mayor has submitted, they have to wait until he submits another name. Sort of a rather nuanced process, but that was sort of Don's forte. He liked nuance and structure. And so again, a battle on the city council. Most of the council members don't like that proposal. Don has to petition again. He has a battle with the city council on the wording of the charter amendment, because while the charter commission decides what goes on the ballot, the city council determines the wording and doesn't like the wording of his proposal. Tony Scallon has an alternate proposal, and long and the short of it is that Don does get his charter plan approved by the voters in 1989, the same year that he's elected to his final term. So that's basically what my knowledge about charter change sort of ends in 1989, which was quite a long time ago. But I don't believe that there's been a major restructuring, particularly in terms of the mayor council power sharing since then. I mean, there has been some tweaks to the charter, but I don't know that there's been anything a major really done since then. So
Oh,
So I think you're right. 1989 is the last significant attempt to change the roles and responsibilities of the leadership.
how did he pass that?
Well, he campaigned for it. I think he sort of campaigned as part of his mayoral campaign, and he came up, I think, with a fund to do advertising, and I think I came across some of the ads that he used. So, you know, he used his bully pulpit to get support for it. I'm pretty sure that the newspapers endorsed Don's plan. I have to go back and look at it. I don't know, Lee, you were around, or rest of you might be able to chime in as well, because I think you were around during that period. But
Can I have a point of personal privilege here, Mr. Chair and moderator? I fear that my work obligations will take me away from this, and I won't have this opportunity. So, Iric, I just want to say that from my standpoint, Mayor Fraser deserves a world of credit for taking this on. And I had not even understood the full extent of his efforts. And my own view is that other mayors, and I don't mean any disrespect, but I think they might even acknowledge as much, have made a decision that the political pain of trying to do this is just not worth the effort. And so I think Mayor Fraser really deserves an awful lot of credit for what he did, what he tried to do. And I think you may know this, but Mayor Fraser was a supporter of what we were trying to do in 2009, and even after I left the council, along with Martin Sable and others, was very supportive of it. So his passion for the mechanics of city government had not waned over the years, but I just wanted to say that the political calculations that I think others might have made, and maybe even frankly have made, that this just wasn't worth the effort, I think he deserves a lot of credit, because he could have made that same political calculation, and he decided, no, this was really important for the well-being of the city. So I just have to get that off my chest in case I didn't have another chance to do that.
Well, I have a question relative to the effort to pull this together, because in the face of opposition from the Charter Commission to put on the ballot what he wanted, he in effect had to go out and petition. What did he do in two arenas? One, which was the city employees who had in earlier elections clearly been fairly allied with the city council, a very large number of them, and their unions were allied with the city council. And the second was the role of the DFL party at that time. Do you recall either of those two?
That's really interesting about the DFL. I don't know that the Minneapolis DFL took a stand on that, because, you know, you had council members like Tony Scallon, who were very, I think Steve Kramer was against it. I think one of the few council members who supported Don was Kathy O'Brien, and I can't remember exactly who was on the council when. Lee, when you were on the council, were Tony, Kathy, and
no, I was on the council from 74 to 77, and so I was on the finance commission that Mayor Hosted set up, and I was one of the. I broke with other council members, Tom Johnson, a couple others, broke with kind of the leadership in part over this charter issue. I became convinced after about a year on the council that we needed a strong mayor form of government. And of course, most of the leadership of the council and majority, you know, really didn't want to give up power on the city council. And in part, that was one of the reasons I ran for mayor in 77 when Hosted had lost and was trying to come back, and I had a very close race. And then in 79, Hosted pulled out like 5 days before the election, and I announced, and then Fraser came back, and that's when I went to the airport to try to talk Fraser out of it, because there was no way I was going to win against Don, but I still ran. And so right after that, I met with Don at his house, and the main thing I talked to him about is, you know, because he had a popular base, that he should take on charter reform. In typical Don Fraser way, he kind of was not committal about it. And I was a little disappointed that he didn't come out right away on the charter reform. But I think as he got into the office further, he decided that he wanted to, or he needed to take on the issue. But it's the same problem that everybody's had along the way, and in terms of moving that. And I think we heard from Paul Ostro about his efforts, coming as a council president, trying to move in that direction. But even there, he was only able to get 6 of his members to come along with him on that. So anyway, the question I had though is, you wrote in this editorial about the 1970 St. Paul passed a strong mayor form of government. And I was wondering, I don't know much about that. Do you know much about what went on that?
I really don't actually, because some of you may have seen this op-ed piece I wrote about the 1929 battle in St. Paul. And while I said at the beginning of my comment that in St. Paul, early on, at least in 1900, there was a lot of unity, actually by 1929, that had broken apart some, and the labor management consensus that had been a hallmark of St. Paul city government broke apart, particularly after the 1917 streetcar workers strike, which is very bitter, and there's quite a bit of violence in St. Paul. So St. Paul labor was not as aligned with the business community as it had been earlier, and so that was the reason for the battle over a city manager. I don't know what happened when the strong mayor proposal was adopted in 1970. When I was researching St. Paul, and I thought it was rather audacious of myself, I wrote a book about downtown St. Paul, not being a St. Paul person at all. I could not find there was almost no written history about the St. Paul charter structure in St. Paul city government. I looked and looked at the library, and finally I did discover that 1970 was the year that St. Paul went from a commission form of government with the city council members serving as department heads to a strong mayor. I don't know whether there was a big battle back then, and I can't even tell you who the mayor was in 1970, but it happened. And it is interesting. We just look across the river, and I think it's such an interesting issue on so many dimensions. St. Paul seems to be so much more settled. I mean, St. Paul certainly has not had the huge internal police battles, the police union, the Crolls of St. Paul. So St. Paul's, seems to have their act together better than we do in some cases. So anyway, that now, I do quote Denny Schroeder in my book, saying that he thinks that Minneapolis actually has in effect a strong mayor position because of the role of the mayor on the executive committee. I don't know, probably the rest of you have talked about that before, and I do sort of bristle every time I see the newspaper talking about the fact that Minneapolis has a weak mayor form of government, because I think what Minneapolis really has, and I'm sure you've discussed this, is a hybrid form of government, not quite strong mayor, but sort of moving that way. And but because we've got so much nuance and complexity, it does make the process very difficult.
So I just had a bit more to add about sort of this question of where the DFL party was. After I left the city council, I was so disgusted with the way in which my convention was handled, because there were some irregularities in balloting and things, that I ran for 5th District Congressional Chair, which included Minneapolis. And as a result, the 5th District Chair, as 5th District Chair, before that convention, I was going to chair the convention where Fraser ended up getting endorsed, but then I decided to run when Hosted pulled out. So, but I was 5th District Chair until I think 1983. And as I recall during that period, there wasn't a lot of engagement in city politics. It was more as a congressional district, you know, people were more involved at level above that. And even though, so there wasn't really, I think maybe later they formed like a city DFL organization, but I don't think there was a lot of engagement, and I don't recall. And of course, then after I left, I wasn't as involved in city DFL politics in the later 80s because I was working with the state. So I don't have the information about what the DFL party, but I don't think they were very engaged, again, because the party was more focused at the congressional district and state level.
That's so true. That's so true. It was a penalty for running for state or Hennepin County delegate that you had to go to the Minneapolis convention. I mean, that you were automatically, and nobody went. I mean, it just was not a significant thing. Under Fraser, you know, the reason St. Paul, as I think about the mayors of both cities over the years, St. Paul's always had a dramatic sort of well-known public mayor. You know, I mean, just think of Latimer, or before him, that guy that used to change the lights as he went. Do you remember that? Anyway, I can't, of course, remember his name, but he was very dramatic, and people knew who the mayor was.
I think it was McCarthy.
McCarthy, yes.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. McCarthy. Yeah, that's a good name in St. Paul. But Minneapolis, you know, can you, Lyndon Carlson, remember who's been the mayor of Minneapolis, except for that awful police standing? Anyway, didn't we used to have a city manager kind of person?
Yeah, coordinator, city coordinator.
Well, but the city coordinator, and you know, I think Clarence and Paul really know this even better than I do. The city coordinator really is not a city manager, because the city coordinator does only oversees a fairly narrow slice of city government. And Kathy O'Brien, I don't know if you've met with Kathy. Kathy O'Brien was city city coordinator for a while. So
That's right.
there are see how many charter department heads. Which means that they're in the charter. I think there are like eight or nine charter department heads, of which I think the coordinator is one of them, but he's just supposedly one among equal, and so he's really not a city manager.
Right. Now, those major departments did not report to him, but significantly, the role evolved so that he became, in effect, the budget manager.
Mm-hmm.
And that had a lot of clout, a lot of influence, initially reporting to the city council and then increasingly to the mayor. So the city coordinator became an increasingly visible and important kind of person. And at one point was the city engineer, had been the city engineer. And so he had a lot of inside work with the public works department. But yeah, no, it was a significant, and it is a significant role, not, again, like you had said, person in charge of all the departments. He doesn't appoint the department heads, and they don't report to him.
It was when Tommy Thompson, who had been, as Clarence said, the city engineer coordinator, he was a pretty powerful person, but the city council was his boss. The president of the city council was his boss.
And I think, Lee, during that period before the Minneapolis Community Development Agency was created, which was in 1982, maybe, the city coordinator really oversaw downtown development. So that made the coordinator a very powerful position, because there was a lot of downtown development going on with tax increment financing. When the MCDA was created, pulling together the Housing and Redevelopment Authority, the Industrial Development Commission, and then the coordinators downtown development functions into one department. That was a big, that was a major change in city structure, but that was done without a charter. Well, I can't remember. Was that done with the? I don't think
No,
that
there was no charter commission. That was
was the
just,
charter, yeah. And that was actually a big deal because, of course, the mayor then had to give up his appointment powers over the
Housing Redevelopment Authority.
other HRA. So the mayor sort of ran the Housing and Redevelopment Authority, which actually had a lot of responsibility for some of the neighborhood development and as well as public housing. And then when the MCDA was created, public housing was split off as a separate entity. So yeah, so as I say, interesting, and one of the reasons as I write about some of this stuff is that we should those of us that are still around do remember some of that, but we're not going to be around forever, and those that history really does need to be preserved.
But I think you're right, Eric. The autonomy of the HRA was significant, and they sort of did their thing. They had the mayor appointing the heads of it, but they undertook the entire clearance of all the lower loop and the rebuilding of the thing. Got all their money from the federal government.
Yeah.
Federal government sent the money in, and we had this separate autonomous organization that executed to do the job. The city was aware of what it was doing, and it had some approval authority, clearly on the zoning side and some other aspects, but they were not, it wasn't a department of the city like other departments. But it's powerful. I mean, it was remarkable.
Yeah.
I see Janice has a question.
Okay, actually, I'm holding my brand new yesterday copy of your biography of Don Fraser, and I want to thank you for this. What a marvelous book! And I did get through the charter change chapter, which was fascinating. And one thing that you talk about a lot that we at the Civic Caucus in our look back haven't talked a lot about is the battles over how these proposed changes appear on the ballot. And that's certainly going to be an interesting issue coming up in the very near future here. So I would love to hear more thoughts you or indeed anybody has on that.
Yeah. I wish I could remember the exact the wording. And then the other thing, I know that when Don when they got around, because so Don in 1980, well, 88 and 89, in 89 he gets his he petitions to get his proposal on the ballot, and then he was really upset because they placed his proposal between Denny Schulsted's proposal, which was going to reduce the number of the council members, and Tony Scallon's proposal, which is actually diametrically opposed to Don's proposal, even though it was on the ballot. And then the wording, I can't remember what the issue was, but Don really was ready to go to court to sue the council because he felt that that the wording really mischaracterized his proposal. So it was a big battle, and people used to say that Don was so mild-mannered. Well, he wasn't always so mild-mannered. I mean, he would pound the table and he would use naughty words and swear at them. And so finally, I think in the wording, they did come to some kind of compromise on the wording of the 1989 proposal. But I remember how absolutely furious Don was at the council because he felt that they'd really, really tried to screw him with the wording. So it'll be interesting to see how I see in the paper now that we're going to have a police proposal, according to the paper this morning, and how the wording of that proposal is going to be structured, because that's a very obviously such an overarching issue, and the wording is going to be very important. And so that council function is a fairly significant one when it comes to really complicated issues that got a lot of policy implications.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating, and not a lot of time left for all these battles to be fought if it's coming up in November.
Yeah. So.
Well, and it sounds, according to Barry Clegg, there may very well be a rent control charter amendment on the ballot too. which is being brought in. I don't know as much about what's happening there, but
And I would also think that the real advocates, even though there is a proposal by Ellison, Cunningham, and Fletcher on police department, I wouldn't be surprised. Well, I don't know, that maybe the advocates might come out with an even a more extreme proposal on police.
I think you're right. We could end up with 3 or 4 ballot issues related to the charter this next fall.
Yep.
So Iric, I'm jumping back in here at some risk, but so obviously the issue in Minneapolis right now is the police department, how we move forward from this, and my personal view, but it's not just my view, it's the view of many, is that the city leadership for a long time has failed in terms of police accountability and police oversight. And I'm also not alone in the view that our structure of government is a part of that. I'm just wondering, the policing issues and the relationship between the mayor and the police and the council and the police, was that a source of any of this tension? And was that a reason at all for Mayor Fraser's interest in these changes?
Well, I think definitely the police involvement in city politics was a big deal. And, of course, before Al, there was Stenbig, and of course, Stenbig was a police a lieutenant. So I think that the police role, both in politics and the police oversight function, Don brings in Tony Boza to be police chief, and I think Tony, is viewed as this, this image as a reformer. I can't tell you exactly what reforms, but I do think that actually, with regard to gay rights, that was an interesting issue, because one of the concerns that the gay community had during that period was the police raids on the gay bathhouses. And when Tony came in, he declared very early that he was not going to take on this gay bashing as a priority or as a role for the police department. But I think it was the politicization of the police department that Don was concerned about, because the idea was that, if you were a policeman, and, interestingly enough, there was a residence requirement. Police had to live in the city. And so that meant that they could dabble in Minneapolis politics. And the theory was that if you put up the most lawn signs for the guy that won the mayor, you'd be rewarded with a promotion or something in the police department. So so I think Don's wanted to take the police out of politics, and he would say, well, it's perfectly legitimate for the police to have a view on policy issues, or the union could, but not to get involved in actually campaigning for individual people running for city hall. So I think so police reform, as it was viewed then, was considered an issue. And I don't know, frankly, how successful Don was. I think Tony Boza, of course, had a great public image, and he was a very interesting guy. He had terrific quotes, and the media loved him because he always would come out with sort of outrageous things. And he was every progressive's favorite policeman. But as we know, the Minneapolis Police Department's had some longstanding issues that even the most progressive mayors have had a hard time dealing with. So,
do you recall in any of this history, was the mayor and or the city council significantly involved in the approval, in the development and approval of those contracts? I mean, every 2 years we got a renewal.
I don't know. I know that the contracts did come before the executive committee, and I don't know. That was, and mostly what I know is what I read in old newspapers, quite frankly.
Right.
And I don't remember any coverage of that issue, that if there were issues in the contracts with the police union, it didn't get much public exposure. So,
but it seemed like a lot of negotiations around labor contracts were not public. I mean, there was no
I think
real,
that's right. Yeah.
there was no real presentation of the management position publicly.
Yeah.
There wasn't any management position apparently.
Yeah.
And so we just massaged it.
And you know, and the policymakers in City Hall were compromised when it came to labor management issues because they needed the support of the.
Yeah, who represented the city in that process? The city is responsible for the overall responsibility. Someone must have represented the city in that in that negotiating process. Who had to finally approve?
The coordinator did. I think the coordinator probably was the person that was the staff point person on the contract.
But he wouldn't have had the authority to approve.
No, and I think that those contracts did go to the executive committee, and so the executive committee would approve them and then pass them on to the full council. And what happened behind closed doors at the executive committee when these contracts came up, you know, I just don't know.
Could I ask a related question? I think the Board of Estimate and Taxation, which was made up of 3 members, and they had a role in approving contracts. As I mentioned, I'm a retired Minneapolis teacher, and I remember in 1970, there was a teacher's strike. And what was negotiated with the school district had to go before the Board of Estimate and Taxation. So that went beyond the city government. There was actually a role with the school district budget and approval of contracts, because the name Stenvig has come up, and he voted, I think it was made up of 3 people, probably the mayor, maybe the comptroller, and I'm not sure who else.
Yeah,
but Stenvig voted against the approval of the contract that had been settled as part of the teacher's strike, which created a huge backlash because, you know, the entire school district had been shut down in 1970. And they had reached a contractual agreement. And then Stenvig, who had a labor background with the Police Federation, voted against the ratification of the contract as a member of the Board of Estimate and Taxation. I don't even know if it exists or if that's what you're referring to when you say the executive committee.
Yeah, well, that, you know,
I don't think the police contract would go there. The school district would have that because of its taxing authority, because, you know, we levy taxes to support the school, and that there where the interest that I think the tax and estimation would come to play there. Right. I think that if we're going to have any significant impact on police reform, there has to be an intersection with whoever approves has the approving authority for the agreement with the labor.
But I guess my question was, does the Board of Estimate and Taxation even exist anymore?
Oh yeah, it does. But I'd never heard about their role in approving contracts, and I had always thought, and again, I'm not. That I didn't realize that the Board of Estimate and Taxation had a role with the school board, because
I don't think they do.
They do not now. They do not now, but they did then, because the state then created independent school districts, and we became an independent school district.
Oh, okay, all right.
Out of the role of the city's approval of their mill levies. Before that, they had approval of mill levy.
Well, you know, and it's interesting, and this is another interesting point between Minneapolis and St. Paul that I like to talk about. You know, we have a Board of Estimate and Taxation, and it's been quite a hot issue. I mean, probably many of you remember that, I don't know what, 10 years ago, maybe less, that there was an effort to abolish the Board of Estimate. And there was a huge backlash because the park board folks, that gave the park board a seat at the table when the tax levies were determined, and the park board did not want the Board of Estimate to disappear because they didn't want to be under the thumb of the I think there are people in City Hall that feel we shouldn't have an independent park board, which
Well,
by the way,
the reason for
not have.
the reason historically for the Board of Estimate Taxation is because Minneapolis was different than St. Paul, because we had the three freestanding, totally autonomous organizations: the Park Board, the Library Board, and the School Board.
Yep.
And they all levied taxes, and they had the city. So we created the Board of Estimate to create the maximum levy total on the taxes, and that's why the thing existed.
My guess is that Stenvig, they probably didn't have a vote on the contract, but maybe he voted against the mill levy for the school board.
As I listen to the discussion, I think you're correct on that. I think, the strike settlement had costs, of course. There was a pay increase and reducing class sizes, and there were a number of issues that had been on the table. And so there was a cost. And when I use the word contract and listen to your discussion, I think it may have been the impact on the levy, perhaps. And that's where the Board of Estimate and Taxation came in.
And there are elected members on the Board of Estimate and Taxation too.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, Steve Brandt is running for the Board of Estimate. We all know Steve Brandt as the longtime City Hall reporter for the Star Tribune, and I thought it's really interesting that he took on that role. And so we'll have, and I think they're both vacancies on the board, because the two incumbents whose names I'm blocking on now, of course, are
Carol Becker, is she still?
Carol Becker.
Yeah, Carol Becker is stepping down. She's been, a real sort of vocal. She's got lots of views on city issues, and she, writes a lot of op-ed pieces. But the Board of Estimate is still around, and I don't know if the Charter Commission is going to look at doing something with it. But I think an effort to eliminate it would run into real pushback from the Park Board.
Carol Becker was one of the leaders that helped defeat that amendment. The people, Wally Swan was on it and I just saw him at a meeting last night. And Gordon Nelson was there for many years.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Right. But it
Pat knows all those names.
the autonomy of the school, of the now remaining only board whose levy they really review, apart from the city council, is the Park Board.
Yeah.
So the issue now is about the Park Board. Are we going to have a freestanding Park Board with its own police department, its own employees, its own contracts, its own levy, its relationships of lobbying with the legislature, everything that goes on with that body? That's the question. But that's not actively under consideration in the discussions so far of the Charter Commission.
Yeah, they probably would not be a wise idea to combine it at this point.
Yeah, there are probably so many other issues that the city's facing right now that probably that's something that it would be smart not to take that issue on. There's so much else that we're going to have to deal with.
So forgive me, everyone. I'm jumping back in. I just can't help myself. I just want to throw out there, and Pat, I know you'll remember this. The Park Board is getting $11 million a year, and they're essentially getting it from City Council funds. Because what happened was the Park Board wanted to go out for a referendum. And when they wanted to go out for a referendum, I'm sorry, when they wanted to go out for a referendum, they were adamant opposition on the City Council of the Park Board going out for a referendum. And they also, the Board of Estimate and Taxation wasn't willing to vote for a tax increase that the Park Board wanted to fund it. And so my own personal opinion was that this clearly violated the city charter, because what they figured out a way to do was to funnel sales tax and other types of dollars to the Park Board without having to increase the levy and without going for a referendum. I only feel like I have to throw that out there because that's one of just a seemingly infinite number of bizarre types of workarounds that are constantly happening. where people are figuring out ways to work around the charter. So I had to get that off my chest too. I'm sorry. But
when I was represented the 7th Ward on the city council, I used to say I represented 2/3 of the ward because all the lakes and parks I didn't have any control over. So.
I wanted to break in for a second. I heard T making what sounded like a really interesting point about the upcoming issue and the intersection of, well, you can finish it perhaps. We're such a good conversation here. I think yours got kind of covered up.
What I'm saying is that in order to make any significant changes with the Minneapolis Police Department's structure or anything, one is going to have to deal with the Police Federation, the labor side of that, and their contract is running out, and they're going to have to negotiate a new one. And I think that there needs to be some way to participate in that process, or lay out some of the issues that need to be under consideration, so that if the contract is not approved, that I think we might have to take it to the brink of saying that without these changes, without the police chief and others having the authority to dismiss errant police officers, there will be no contract. Because until that kind of discipline can be in the hands of those who are running the department, that we are going to get the kinds of changes that are needed. And I don't hear anyone talking about trying to address that issue in terms of the approval of that. Let's not have any approval. So they threaten to strike. Well, can it get really any worse than it is now?
I mean, your point, T, is that is the role of the city council and the mayor. They are the signatures on the management side of this thing. And they have repeatedly signed this thing every 2 years. It comes through and there's never any published disagreement. It's been going on as though everything was okay. And now you're suggesting that maybe that's not the case, and maybe the mayor and the city council are going to have to step forward and say, here's what we think we have to have in that charter, or in that agreement. And how far you want to push that position may have an influence on the outcome of the election, maybe the charter, and on the question of police discipline.
Yeah, until they take that stand, I don't think we're going to see any significance.
Yeah,
that's a big order. That's a big order. It's going to get a whole lot of folks in the labor world and in the DFL heavily engaged.
Yeah, yeah, and Paul also throws. I mean, and that's such an important issue, because really, if we want real reform, it needs to come through the contracting process. But the charter change, and I read at least scanned the proposal in the paper today that Ellison, Fletcher, and Cunningham have. It's easy to rearrange the boxes publicly and make it appear as if you're solving the problem. And so I think that there are folks that say, well, we have a huge problem with policing public safety in Minneapolis, and the solution to that problem is structural change. Well, structural change is visible, and it appears as if you're solving the problem, but the real solution, as T is pointing out, really would come through the contract process, and you don't need a charter change to do that. And that's where you could probably achieve some real reform. And I think that unfortunately the whole charter issue deflects where the real focus should be.
Well, our council member, Stephen Fletcher, who's one of the people who's proposing this amendment, when we talk with him, we've had a couple of meetings with him where we've talked with him. He doesn't want to touch the union part of this because he's got a union background. So I think it's very complicated. In many of the issues that need to be resolved related to the police department really need to be solved at the state level. And by proposing this defunding the police department, we actually lost seats in the Minnesota legislature in areas outside of Minneapolis because they were afraid we were, we were going too far and that we were going to. So it gets very complicated, but, I'm optimistic that what the Charter Commission is coming out with is going to be that the structural change. I mean, a lot of the problems in city government is it's such a mess that you really don't know who's accountable for what. And the council's going in one direction, the mayor is trying to pull things together somewhat. Our lead group met with him the other night, and, I think there is some kind of common sense things that are being done, but, you've got to tackle all of these issues with the police department. Unless there's one person who can be accountable, I think 14 people trying to be accountable is going to be just a total mess here. So the key issue is going to be, how is this all going to be explained to the public? If you have multiple charter amendments on the ballot, and you have council members going in one direction, and so this is going to be a big issue. That the one thing that may work in our favor is ranked choice voting, though, because it means there are going to be multiple candidates for these offices, and maybe some of these council candidates might be able to help explain this in a positive way to the public. I'm hoping, at least.
Well, don't count on it. I think that until we can get leadership at the council level that is willing to take on this whole issue and take a stance, a definitive stance, without thinking about how this is going to affect my election, we aren't going to get significant change. It's going to go into the charter era, and people are going to believe that they're getting something that they're not getting, and we're going to still see the same kind of behavior at that level. If we can't challenge that contract, then we aren't going to make much progress in bringing about change of behavior.
The other question I've got with respect to the contract is that I understand the sense that you got to do something to change the state law. The question is, how did the Minneapolis police contract and its provisions appear to be mirrored in the state policy with respect to employee bargaining? Something happened that the police got covered by this arbitration method that was established for others. And I don't know if that happened before the contract or if it happened after the contract because of some advocacy on the part of the union. There's a story there that has not been told. The more interest and focus there is on the contract, the more that the leaders of Minneapolis are going to have to take on a position with respect to what they're going to do. Because it's very clear where the union's coming from, and it has always been. I understand that. Question is, what's management doing?
Yeah, and I think Fletcher's role is really interesting because obviously, a good progressive DFLer can't appear to be anti-union, but as one of my labor friends here in the building says, well, we shouldn't really call the Police Federation a union because they're not part of the labor movement. That they're it's not the same kind of thing that the service workers or AFSCME are dealing with. They're at a different level. So these are complicated issues, and politics is floating above all of this. And I think for some of us, me included, I thought, it'd be nice to take a little break from politics for a while, but we can't. We got an election coming up, in a few months, and so we're going to have to get involved in all this messy stuff again.
Right.
I might chime in a little bit on the. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
On the PELRA, I was in the legislature when PELRA was passed in 1973. And a big part of the discussion was how you would treat certain employee groups, especially those involved with things like public safety. And part of that discussion was the right to strike, whether there would be a limited right to strike, whether they should be treated through arbitration as opposed to being able to strike. And a lot of that discussion was police and fire, and not so much local per se, but just generally, you know, whether you were talking about the highway patrol or on a statewide basis, or prison guards and what have you. There were certain categories of employees that they decided when PELRA was passed that they would have a vehicle through arbitration. Now that's been kicked around through the years and changed to some degree. But if you put PELRA on the table for any kind of a discussion, you'll get quite a strong backlash from the public employee unions in particular, and support from the labor movement generally, because they become very protective of PELRA and the right to bargain.
Yeah.
And so there have been proposals to change that. And so the decision in recent years has been not to take PELRA up at all because of potential amendments and so on that might take place. So I just thought I would chime in when you say, how did arbitration come about? There's been changes to some degree through the years, but that was kind of the core of it.
But that's partly what I understand, at least the last session, when PELRA did come up, and they did make an exception, a specific exception targeted to the selection of the arbiters in the arbitration process. So they intervened into the thing and modified it. And
yeah, well, that's what I mean. There's been some modification. I was just kind of giving the history.
But the question is there. The question is there.
Yeah.
It's a real issue.
That came up as part of the reforms dealing with the whole question of the policing in Minneapolis and generally. And so that's what I meant. There's been some modifications, but
I mean, the push is still
arbitration is still in the PELRA law, and to make major changes in arbitration, I'm just saying, creates a political difficulty with the makeup of the legislature.
Can I say one more thing about the legislative action or inaction that could be taken, and that and this is from Jack, who says that Minneapolis legislators as a whole had quite a few challenges this time, and without the leadership of the Minneapolis delegation, that's not going to happen at the legislature. And what Minneapolis legislator is going to support changing PELRA? None. So you're back to dealing with the city, I think.
Well, you know, actually, we met with.
Can I just say one more thing before, because you think that ranked choice voting is going to make a difference. I think it's going to, all the incumbents, I think, on the Minneapolis City Council, I'm not sure about Lisa, but most of them had opponents who were part of our revolution, and most of them won. And when you get to ranked choice voting and who's supporting what charter amendment, the incumbents are going to have a lot of power, and they're all our revolution. So I don't know why you think ranked choice voting will help, which I hate.
Well, we'll see.
We'll see. You're right. We're going to see.
But we met with Senator Dietzig, Terry Dietzig, who has been, and they actually, the DFLers tried to get a number of changes through the legislature. They weren't able to do it, right after. Some of them they did, but the Republicans have been resisting a lot of the changes. So it's actually, they've been trying to make more changes that would give more control over the police department. So it's not, but because they don't control the Senate, the chances of them.
But their changes were all external to the contract. Their changes were to, hey, let's have a commission, let's have some other outside authority. But we're not going to touch the basic disciplinary authority of the chief.
Okay.
That game is going to be played with the union central to that discussion. So they didn't want to change that. And the Republicans apparently did say, yeah, we've got to change that. And finally, they ended up with the compromise they did on all of these things. Did some of the things, not many, but some of the things that the advocates wanted. And then they did modify the Pell Rate. Now, there are others who say we still have other changes to make, but it's not clear that they want to change Pell Rate. And the question still is central. How are you going to get any decisions by the chief enforced when it comes to the behavior of any of the cops in the system?
So one of the things, there's just kind of an anecdote here, but when I was on the council, somebody told me, it may have been like Russ Green or one of these people who had been around for a long time, but Minneapolis had residency requirements, I think for the schools at one point,
right.
Also for city employees. And one of the reasons they got rid of those residency requirements was because there were such a concentration of like police and firemen that in the fourth ward and places that they had too much influence over contracting. So the original, now there's concern about residency, that the fact that so many police live outside of the city, but at the time it was, there was concern about maybe too much influence over the contracts.
Right. The contracts have been the hidden story that nobody has really examined very closely. Nobody touches it. And yet it's central to the discussion of what's going on here.
What, the residency?
Oh, the contracts. The contracts. What's in those contracts?
Yeah.
And the interest on the part of those unions is manifest in the campaigns for council members and in the charter changes.
Yeah, and I see Paul Ostro has added to the chat function here. He says part of the problem is that the updates are done behind closed doors. Negotiations can be an exception to the open meeting law.
Right.
Yeah. So that's Paul's comment in the chat.
So the labor discussions are exempt from any open meeting requirement. So the public wouldn't know, and the newspapers don't know, and so nobody covers it. Nobody knows, and then all of a sudden, magically, the signatures appear and the contract is signed, and then we go on with business. And there's no follow-up story about what happened in the contract. Did we change anything? What really even happened financially? What are the financial consequences of it? No discussion. It's just, oh, this is agreement. Isn't it wonderful? We got agreement, and we'll go on living. This happens in contract after contract.
Can I ask what makes labor negotiations exempt to the open meeting law, if anyone knows?
That was the legislature. That was an exception to that because labor, wanted it that way to make it simple.
Yeah.
And they had the political power to make it happen. And I think there are some good reasons for having that there.
Yeah.
Basically, the debate when Pell Rate was passed, we had before Pell Rate the law was meet and confer, which has a totally different history and a lot of its own complications. So when Pell Rate was passed, when it came up to the collective bargaining question, I think it's fair to say to some degree, both sides, management and labor, were concerned about negotiating in what they called the fishbowl and the difficulty you might have in arriving at an agreement if you were publicly making concessions. So therefore, the exemption for collective bargaining. Also, and I think what goes to the core of what you're talking about here and what was changed to some degree during the last session was when you're dealing with employee discipline problems, so to speak, the right to a hearing and all that takes place there, and how public that should be. And so those things have been debated many times through the years, but.
So Lyndon, can I jump into the question about that?
Sure.
My
I'm just
take
trying to give the history as best I can remember it.
Yeah, and I'm sorry for interrupting. I'm kind of
48 years ago when all this was debated.
So isn't it a fair statement though that disciplinary type of procedures those are private? You can't make those public. There are rights involved but labor negotiations are permissively can be closed based on the judgment of the body that public interest is served because of the reasons you talked about. But there's nothing, I don't believe, that mandates that an elected body close discussions of labor negotiations. Am I right about that?
I think you're correct. I think it's the flip side. You can do it legally.
Yeah.
Have private negotiations, but there's nothing that prevents you from having them open if you choose. Yeah. I would assume
I only make this
both sides of the table.
Yep. Well, I don't know that there would have to be agreement. Anyway, I only make that point because I think that's a crutch that elected officials use. I think that they're allowed to close it, but they don't have to. And if the public interest requires that debate be public, which I would argue it does, I guess my sense is that they have every right to have those conversations public, and they're choosing not to. That's the only point I'm trying to make.
Can I just interject here that when some history, my husband and I, as most of you know, owned the weekly newspaper in Elbow Lake during the late 70s and early 80s. And one of my jobs was reporting on 3 different school districts. And in each one of those, maybe they didn't know that it was exempted. They contacted me about when their negotiation meetings were going to be. I was there. I went through entire pregnancies going through negotiations, and they would try to do things like hold the meetings at 6 a.m, hoping I wouldn't come, but I came. So that's interesting. Yeah.
Say, folks, I have unfortunately have to get on to another Zoom this morning, so I'm going to have to bow out. But this has been just a great conversation, and thank you very much for inviting me, and a lot of interesting issues that you folks are getting into. So,
Right.
Well, thank you so much for your
Thank you
time and
very much. Yeah.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Eric.